Water, flowing through a desert that shouldn't have any. They say Egypt invented pyramids, but that's not the craziest thing they built. Almost 4,000 years ago, long before the Suez Canal existed, Egypt carved a secret waterway through the desert. A canal so massive, it connected the Nile to the Red Sea. No machines, no engines, just tens of thousands of workers digging a path through boiling sand. For a purpose nobody fully understands even today. It was the first sign that Egypt wasn't a normal kingdom. It was a preview. As any kingdom can build temples, but only a superpower can split the desert in half. And yeah, also a warning of a civilization that would dominate the ancient world for 3,000 years. To understand how Egypt reached that kind of power, you have to go back, way back. Before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before Egypt even had a name. Because the story of this desert empire doesn't begin with kings. It begins with water. Without it, the desert was death. Sandstorms buried homes. The sun turned the earth to fire. One wrong step, one dry season, and entire villages vanished. The canal you just saw, that was only the start. The true secret of Egypt was the Nile, a river that carved life into a desert no one else could survive. A river that could give food and take it away just as easily. Every year it rose without warning. Floods that swallowed fields, floods that drowned entire villages. And yet, when it receded, it left behind black, fertile soil, a miracle in the middle of death. People flocked to it. They built homes along its banks, barely daring to hope they would survive. Fishermen, farmers, wanderers, all drawn by this river that could kill and sustain in the same breath. They watched it, learned its moods, measured the water, dug channels, stored grain, built embankments. Every action was a gamble, a battle against nature itself. And slowly from this struggle, something extraordinary emerged. Villages became towns, towns became cities, cities became a civilization unlike anything the world had seen. Control of the Nile meant control of life. Those who mastered it could feed armies, build monuments, command respect, and those who failed vanished. Two lands arose from its power: Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north. For centuries they clashed. Rivers were battlegrounds, tribes became armies, ambition became war, until one ruler united them both. The first pharaoh, the one who looked at the river and saw a kingdom. From the banks of the Nile, he built cities that gleamed in the sun. Wood and mud became fortresses. Grain became power. Laws were carved. Soldiers were trained. The desert no longer ruled the people. The pharaoh ruled the desert. And then came the monuments. Not for gods, not for funerals, but for legacy. Massive stone structures rising from sand. Blocks so heavy, it would take thousands of men just to move one. And yet, they did it. Every time. These were the pyramids. Silent, eternal, impossible. Tombs for kings who were more than men. The deserts tested their strength, but the people obeyed, because survival meant loyalty. Trade routes stretched along the river, bringing gold, copper, and exotic goods. Ambassadors arrived from distant lands. Enemies watched in awe and fear. Power became administration. Scribes counted grain, priests recorded laws, engineers mapped canals. A state appeared, complex, ruthless, efficient. Messengers ran the river like highways. Taxes flowed, armies organized. Their economy ran on resource loops: gold from Nubia, copper from Sinai. Grain moved as currency, diplomacy, and leverage. Borders expanded because supply chains allowed it. Not courage alone, but the tools of control also created dependence. Granaries filled, but harvests failed when the Nile misread its season. Canals silted. Labor revolts flared. Corruption crept into councils. A machine built to last began to show wear. Kings declared themselves gods to keep order. That worked for a while. Religion fused with politics. Temples controlled land, and priests controlled kings. Power became a balance of throne, temple, and army. Tip that balance, and chaos followed. Empires watch one another. Egypt's fame attracted traders, spies, and enemies. Information reached foreign courts long before armies did. How Egypt organized water, labor, and storage became a blueprint others wanted to steal, not copy. Their invincibility wasn't questioned, but studied. When the outsiders finally moved, they didn't move like raiders. They arrived like a system, deliberate, structural, patient. The first major wave came from the northeast. The delta, rich with ports and grain, became the empire's softest edge, a door they never treated like a threat until someone stepped through it. Then came the Hyksos. They didn't wait for floods or seasons or prophecies. They brought animals built for distance, weapons built for momentum, and for the first time in millennia, someone entered Egypt faster than news of them traveled. Chariots appeared in the horizon like thunder with wheels, a speed Egypt never needed and never built. Cities scrambled not because they lacked fighters, but because they had never fought something that moved this fast. The delta bowed first, not to strength, but to surprise. Egypt wasn't overpowered. It was overtaken in silence measured by shock. And yet, the South still watched. Far from the invaded edge, Thebes began calculating a response that wouldn't mirror the North's fate. But before pharaohs could plan revenge, more powers gathered. The Mediterranean had new kings. The deserts had new alliances. Borders once distant began overlapping Egypt's world like tightening rings. Thebes, perched on the upper Nile, had learned a lesson centuries earlier. Distance is power. While the North shook under surprise, the South studied the enemy quietly. They watched, they measured, they planned. The Nile's currents became their map, its flood cycles their calendar. Grain was stockpiled where it mattered most. Canals were widened and deepened, roads strengthened, forts reinforced. The South had patience that stretched like the river itself. When the Hyksos and other outsiders struck, Thebes didn't rush. It moved deliberately, absorbing knowledge of every tactic, every weakness, every weapon. Chariots, studied, replicated, improved. Armies, trained with discipline honed by centuries of survival. Governance, streamlined so no single mistake could ripple into chaos. And slowly, the South became the engine of revival. The North may have bowed to shock, but the South rebuilt, reinforced, and mastered. Egypt didn't just survive these shocks, it learned from them. Every incursion, every attempt to overtake the empire became a lesson etched into its systems. But Egypt ruled long not because it was perfect, but because it kept evolving while keeping the illusion that it never had to. For 3,000 years, threats came. But they came one at a time. If the desert rebelled, the river solved it. If enemies attacked, prepared cities slowed them. If grain failed, reserves clothed the crisis in silence. If a leader died, the system replaced him before chaos could sit on the throne. Egypt's real empire wasn't its land, or its gods, or its kings. It was the machinery behind all of it, a civilization that pre-planned unpredictability itself. But eventually, unpredictability wasn't the enemy anymore. Acceleration was. The world stopped moving at the slow rhythm of rivers and began sprinting at the speed of iron, horses, and conquest. Persians didn't dig canals, they rode beside them. Greeks didn't build sanctuaries, they built strategies. Rome didn't worship nature, it weaponized logistics. And Egypt, the ancient architect of endurance, found itself standing in a new arena it had never drawn the map for. When Persia marched in, it didn't breach Egypt by starvation or siege or fear. It entered through administration. Because Egypt's structure was so good that it could be hijacked rather than destroyed. Persian kings kept the granaries running but replaced the name carved above them. They issued decrees through Egyptian scribes, but with foreign signatures. Egypt wasn't conquered like a war trophy. It was acquired like infrastructure. Then came Alexander the Great. He didn't fear Egypt. He admired it like a plan. He marched to Memphis, paused, looked at the pyramids, the irrigation veins, the organization, the belief network, and made a decision no invader before him had made. He wouldn't remove Egypt from the world. He would rebrand it into the world. Greek rulers learned Egyptian symbols. They spoke the language of divinity and monarchy Egypt had perfected. The famous Cleopatra dynasty, Greek blood, Egyptian crown. They ruled with the mask of pharaohs, not the methods of outsiders. And Egypt accepted them, not because it was broken, but because Egypt followed continuity, not ethnicity. But symbolism can only hold power until systems overpower symbolism itself. Rome arrived last. Not silent like Persia, not curious like Greece, but hungry like history. Rome ruled with something Egypt couldn't counter anymore. A global economy bigger than a river could feed. Armies faster than predictions could calculate. A trade empire sailing seas Egypt once thought were geographical walls. A political machinery heavier than stone and smoother than papyrus. Egypt didn't collapse under Rome. It shrank under comparison. For the first time in thousands of years, there was a power Egypt could not imitate, a structure Egypt could not scale to, a speed Egypt could not absorb quietly. Because innovation no longer required patience, belief, or labor in the tens of thousands. It required empires of empires. Egypt's 3,000-year rule didn't end in a moment. It ended in a transition. And that's how the empire of sand and water kept its crown for 3,000 years. Not by being unbreakable, but by being irreplaceable. Until the day it finally was. Egypt didn't fall when an army marched in. It fell when the world stopped needing a first anymore. The Nile kept giving life. But life outside Egypt had become louder, faster, stranger, hungrier. Progress no longer knocked on the gates politely. It didn't need permission. So Egypt faded out of relevance, the same way it once rose into dominance, gradually, naturally, undeniably. Not erased, not defeated, just compared and surpassed. And maybe that's the greatest proof of its power, that even in its end, Egypt never disappeared from the story of the world. It became the prologue, the golden template, the ancient tutorial level everyone had to play before unlocking the rest of history. The Desert Empire stopped ruling the world, but it never stopped haunting it. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe our channel, The Curious Corner, for more fascinating content.